What we got dain in your dagum thaud caninga thrum yafrunan, who the other lingers, Ellen Fremedon. Off Chilch, I won't go on. The point about the beginning of Beowulf, which is what Tolkien used to come in and deliver famously to his students, I think is really important in terms not just only of his own academic development, but I think also in terms of the work that he did beyond academia. And I apologize for giving you two handouts. It's like there'll be a short quiz at the end. And only very few of you will survive it. I just think giving you visual handouts means you don't have to look at me so much. What we gardena in Yardagam Thurkeninger. So the point about that, I think, is really at the basis of Tolkien's whole idea of what it was to be old, authentic, and literature. What? Listen. We've heard tell in days of old of the deeds of the famous, the mighty kings of the Spear Danes, how those nobles did deeds of valor. It's only 3 lines, and my wife and I named our eldest child Ellen after line 3 of Beowulf. It was slightly upsetting when a few years later we had a son, and our daughter said, "Are we going to call him Fremedon?" I had to explain that speaking as an orchard, the initials FO were not ideal to be carrying through life. So he's called Oscar. Again, I tried to be Tolkienian. Oscar is one of the very few, are there any Oscars in the audience before I carry this story further? Okay, good. Oscar is one of the very few names where if you look it up in the big boys and girls book of baby names, you'll find that Oscar is, on the one hand, it's Germanic. Ansgar, Oscar, the spear of the gods. And it's also Celtic. Oscar. And it means, if you look at the books, the lover of the deer. The child who loves deer. The Finn legends. These are things that would have appealed to Tolkien. These are things that very much appealed to us 16 years ago when we named our son. I have to tell you, and this is one of the tragedies of being an academic, one of the many tragedies of being an academic, apart from, no money, bad hair, really bad teeth, afflictions with alcohol, is that a very wonderful colleague of mine, a German scholar, and there are no scholars scarier than the Germans, as Tolkien would have agreed, demonstrated a couple of years ago, and I haven't broken it to my son for reasons which are obvious, that in fact we think that Oscar, os is deer in Irish. Careth, cariad, loves. And a German has demonstrated beyond peradventure that in fact it's a false etymology and that really it's o and scareth. And Oscar means the boy with the pierced testicles. If you know any Oscars, gently. 2 handouts. One is in sort of. I wasn't quite sure what to expect, and after I heard that you had the benefit of Mark Atherton last year, where he was singing and playing, and I could do neither of these things. This one is, if you like, the main handout, and then the second one saying "Selig Spell, a marvelous tale." I made up literally yesterday morning, when it suddenly occurred to me when I was rereading Tolkien's translation of Beowulf, that Christopher Tolkien says some, I think, rather understated things about his father's Old English. It's a brilliant piece of Old English, and Christopher says there's no point in having a literal translation because it would be boring and dull and And I suddenly thought, actually, it is quite useful to have a literal translation of the Old English, because it's absolutely not what you have in the modern English in the preceding two versions. So I'm of that generation when I can't type. I'm very much a two-finger typist. This is A and S. Think about the keyboard, and this is all the other letters. And so I did this yesterday morning, so there will be typos, but I was delighted to find a mistake in the Old English, which I will go back and check, but I suspect it's... Could you turn off the camera? Christopher's, because I don't want to be sued. So this is a literal translation, and we can talk about this if you like. At the back of it, which is really the point of it, in red runes, just going through my Nick Cave phase, the red runes are important, are a couple of lines of Beowulf, which we'll talk about in a minute. I'm hopeful that at least the first line of these 3 lines of runes will be the runic inscription which will appear on a monument, a plaque for Tolkien, which will be in Pembroke College in Oxford, which is being designed by Tim Tolkien. And there's a scroll, and they want to fill it, and as a fellow of Pembroke, I was quite adamant that I thought, really we should have a piece of Old English, and I could walk towards the door and you can attack me. But I thought, rather than elven runes, we should have some real Old English runes, and perhaps a little bit of Beowulf. We'll discuss what this means in a bit. So, onto the main handout. The point about the first 3 lines of Beowulf is that it talks about a time way back when. Jardagum, days of yore. And it's the Gardena. And those of you who are Radio 4 listeners, this is not Gardena's question time. This is literally the Spear Danes. It's way back when, it's over there, and it's then, and it's them. Different people. And it's a triple distancing motif. These people are not us. These people are not us. And these people are very much not us. And if you read Tolkien's literary creations, he very much keeps those 3 levels of distancing in mind. This is a man who is a convinced Catholic. He's a sub-creator, mythopoeia. He's not trying to make a world which is the world. He's distancing himself from the world that we know, and he's doing it in order to make the case of how we understand the world that we live in. And that's the genius of Tolkien. That we can all identify with Tolkien's created world precisely because it's not familiar, but it kind of is. And it kind of is, I would argue, because of the languages. And Tolkien's genius, among many aspects of it, was that he was the first person who really understood languages. Here I give a nod to Andy. Is that he went through the mill, and I'm going to do a little apologia for my own life. I went to an extraordinary school when I was young. I was a classicist when I was young. And from the age of 14 to 18, every single week of my life, from the age of 14 to 18, we would be given a piece of Shakespeare to turn into Greek iambics and we would be given a piece of Christina Rossetti to turn into Latin elegiac poetry. And this now seems to me cruel and unusual behaviour. But at the time, it was normal, and it was a kind of like what's washed up on the beach. It was the relic of a former time. And this is exactly the education that Tolkien had, that C.S. Lewis had, that was completely normal for people of that era. You would create in other languages whatever you could. So on the front of your handout there, you've got a little bit of Old English poetry. It'll be familiar to many of you. I apologize, it's all washed out. I was explaining to people at the front here. When you get it into decent light, you'll see that this is actually a copy of the first page of one of the 10 original copies of The Hobbit. And it's to Kitty Kilbride. And Kitty Kilbride, I think, is a fantastically interesting person for all sorts of reasons. She got a copy of The Hobbit, signed copy of The Hobbit, with a little bit of Old English. She got a first copy of Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. She got the first copy of The Fellowship of the Ring. She's a Canadian. And having spent 14 years of my life teaching in Canada, I approve this message. And a couple of weeks ago, I was talking in San Francisco, and I use this as an example of, this is Tolkien describing the West Coast, which of course he never visited. It will be familiar to many of you, if not all of you. It's very close to the verses that appear in The Lost Road, that are produced by Alfwine, friend of the elves, his poem, but it's different towards the end, and this is my point. So let me read it to you. I will point out there's a typo. Tolkien made a mistake. I'm so sorry. Kind of moving slowly towards the back of the room. Keep your eyes on me. But he only got 10 copies of The Hobbit to distribute. You can imagine Tolkien writing out the poem. It's in the very last word of the very last line. I imagine the great man going, and then just sending it to Canada. And nobody will ever know. Here we go. I hope you can read this. Felabith on West Wayum, Wareham and Coudra, Wundra and Wichta, Willita Shine Land, Yard Ilva, Erklan Stanas, Ondun Stravas, Dila, and it should say Shinath, but as you'll see, it says Shkninath. I found the mistake, I claim my prize, Christopher. No. And it means there are many places unknown to men on the paths to the west. And they're full of wonders and of amazing creatures, wichta, whites, if you like. It's an amazingly beautiful land. It's an ayard. Notice the rhyming. It's a word that appears also in The Wanderer. We'll come back to The Wanderer later on. This is a poem that he knew well. He quotes, it appears in The Lord of the Rings. It's an ayard ilva. It's the dwelling place of elves. This is not in the Alfwine verses. And just so you know, elves apparently live in Seattle. Earklandstanas, the Arkenstones, amazing, glorious stones, and they shine secretly in cliff dwellings, in holes in the cliffs. It's a beautiful verse. It's a wonderful verse. It's a verse which is to please a student, an ex-student of his from Leeds, a Canadian, And it's his vision of what the West Coast is like. But if you flip the page, you'll see it's part of a much bigger program of reinterpretation of languages that was just completely normal at the time. Now, completely normal, but Tolkien happened to be better at it than everybody else. So pages 2 and 3 of your handout is, as you can see from the top, is C.S. Lewis. Now, C.S. Lewis, I don't know if any of you have heard of him. I know, he's very much still in the wardrobe. But this is what young people of that generation trained in a classical tradition did. Every week of their life, they would create poetry in different languages. And as it happens, in his, and I owe this, let's say discovery, let's call it a discovery, because it's not mine. It's a colleague of mine from Oxford who found this in C.S. Lewis's copy of A Short History of English by Henry Cecil Wilde. Henry Cecil Wilde happened to be one of Tolkien's predecessors in the Merton Chair of English. And as commonly, and I'll talk about this very briefly because it's slightly scurrilous, C.S. Lewis wrote a series of verses basically saying, I really hate my teacher. So if you look at these verses, you'll see the first one is in Latin, and I don't think we need to dignify it too much. Let's just skip down to the last two. E petiga ma nos scythiosque oxonia tandem respuat immundum de sapientis onus. So, go away! Why don't you deal with Gothic stuff or Scythian stuff? Oxford should just spit out this hateful burden of the wild. He then writes a bit in Old English. Lario lados, leod harta, and so on and so forth. And you can see, if you skip down a few lines, oft klochen, kluder, kluneder, and duneder, siran, blah, blah, blah. It's basically saying, this is a man who cannot teach. I loathe him, I despise him, I hate him. We move inexorably. This is all in C.S. Lewis's handwriting, and what can I say? Should have got out more. The next bit is Homeric. Oh, Popeye, mega thalma, tod ophthalmoise aroma. What an amazing sight to see this creature. I'm just trying to find a bit that I can actually quote without being sued. Oh no. Line 2, there we go. Pankakon. Kakos in Greek means bad. Pankakon means without sort of totally becoming a valley girl, like totally bad. Teras is a marvel. Mega therion. Therion is a word meaning a wild beast in Greek, and so on. Academia. So, we've got this horrible wild beast coming into academia, blah, blah, blah. And then, and I like the way that he's crossed it out, it's like, I really can't be bothered with this anymore. This is French, this is Alexandrines. He's talking about his predecessors in the chair. So, Raleigh, Murray, and they're going to find themselves as the compagne to this guy, que l'acadème, and so on. Ainsi sur les longueurs. Triste chien. I think we can all do triste chien. Now, rather oddly, we have lots of this material. I can't imagine why it's never been published. But, for example, we have several verses which some of them are brilliant. I mean, literally, really, really skillful and brilliant, by Alistair Campbell, who was Tolkien's successor but two. And 1946, when Tolkien's chair of Anglo-Saxon was filled by C.L. Wren, Wren's successor, Campbell, wrote a poem in Old English, ASC, Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, 1946, and it just says, Wren, he was horrible, and then goes on for many, many, many verses. And so we also have, I'm not making this up, I can produce this material, I'd just rather not. The beginning of the Iliad into Old English, the beginning of the Odyssey into Old English, the beginning of the Aeneid into Old English, Tennyson, Idylls of the King, beginning into Old English, Milton, the beginning of Milton into Old English, and then a series of very, very, very scurrilous limericks, which I won't repeat. We have a question period later. Which again I won't repeat. And in the beginning of it, rather interestingly, Campbell talks about the fact that Tolkien was one of the people who encouraged people to produce stuff in different languages. This is my point. The beginning of The Lord of the Rings, the beginning of The Hobbit, the beginning of Silmarillion, the beginning of all of these, as everybody has said, and we know, is languages. And this is why other people's fantasy, other people's created worlds do not make the same kind of sense. This is why I cannot, George R.R. Martin, I cannot watch that material, mainly because my wife says I can't. But also, it doesn't make any kind of linguistic, literary sense. They're not worlds that we recognize. That was Tolkien's genius. And in a way, I think Tolkien knew that. Now, and I am happy to answer questions about this, even though I will get sued much more likely than anything I've said about C.S. Lewis so far. But there's a film that's coming out, some of you will know of it, a Tolkien biopic based on John Garth's book, for the most part. And my role in it was languages consultant. And when I was first approached, I thought, I don't want to do this, mainly because I'm scared of people like you. But when they sent me a version of a copy of a script of an earlier version of it, and I worked out that they were actually trying to deal with 9 languages. And I thought, that's actually got a lot of integrity to it. And I pushed for the inclusion of, and this is being recorded, so you can tell me how many languages actually appear. But what should appear is Old English, Old Norse, Gothic, Latin, Welsh, Irish, German, Greek, Latin, Finnish. Now, that was Tolkien's linguistic purview, and I may have missed 1 or 2. But that's the point. So, when we get on to his translation of Beowulf, and this is what I was going to talk about, and I'll be talking about the actual translation in more bloody and gory detail at some point. But I thought it might be useful simply to state something that everybody knows, that in this handout, which is a very boring handout, and I apologize for it, but come on, I could be singing, is that if you look at the middle 2 pages, which are the main ones that I want to talk about, I'm going to give you 4 bits of Beowulf. That's all I'm going to talk about. We'll talk about them in some detail. And genuinely, I think Tolkien is the greatest interpreter of Beowulf so far. In Tolkien's own eyes, it was a man called R.W. Chambers who, in fact, turned down the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professorship of Anglo-Saxon in the University of Oxford. So it's my title, I have to repeat it. I'm contractually obliged. And if anybody wants a business card, I just want you to know it folds out several times. There were a number of issues surrounding his own election, and he himself was always very modest about the fact of his election at such an early age. He never gave an inaugural lecture. He never gave an inaugural lecture when he became the Merton Professor. He never got a doctorate. He never became elected a Fellow of the British Academy. He never did any of the kind of checkbox things that, just as I said that, I realized, I've done, for which I apologize. But that was a reason because he came to it so young. And the reason that he never published much, academically speaking, I think is because he always felt, I'm not quite there yet. It's a great honor to me that next year I've been invited to give the Israel Gollancz lecture for the British Academy, some years after Tolkien gave his most famous one, 1936 lecture. And again, I remember talking to Priscilla Tolkien a couple of years ago about the circumstances surrounding this amazing seismic event. Literally, it changed the way everybody thinks about Beowulf. And I paraphrase Priscilla, but she said that both of her parents went up to London for this great event. And she said they weren't really used to traveling outside. They didn't really travel. So Birmingham, Oxford, London, whoa, crazy. As you can imagine, Priscilla didn't use those precise words. They arrived in London and got out of the train and said to a taxi driver, take us to the British Academy, as you would. And apparently Tolkien didn't quite express himself very well. And the taxi driver chucked him out at the Royal Academy. And so I love this picture of the man who changed the face of Beowulf scholarship, running like hell. Again, I'm sure he didn't say, shit. Going from the Royal Academy to the British Academy to deliver this lecture. My predecessor but two, Tolkien's successor but three, as Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor. This is why I don't have a business card, it's just all on the web. Eric Stanley, who's 94. So slightly older than that upstart Christopher Tolkien, and this is not a slam at all against Eric Stanley, who was taught both by Tolkien and by C.S. Lewis, but he always said, Tolkien, lazy man, lazy, lazy man. And within the field, the fact that Tolkien never published very much at all is a cause of great regret, if I can call it like that. So, and some of you will have seen this, in the last couple of pages of the handout, I went back and using the fabulous Wayne Hammond, Christina Scull chronology, and because I've got no friends, and now you can see why, I just looked at everything that Tolkien ever lectured on while he was doing the job that I do now, and it's mind-blowing. And I've colour coordinated it so you can see he lectured on Old English, of course he did. He lectured on Old Norse, didn't have to, but did. Lectured on Celtic, lectured on philology, and lectured a lot. And my point is that almost every year, and Mike Drought wrote about this in the Tolkien Review, but didn't look at the whole picture. And if you look at the whole picture, almost every year of his life, for 25 years, he was lecturing every single year on Beowulf. Now, again, I shuffle to the back of the room. A statutory professor in Oxford, which is what the Rawlinson and Bosworth professorship is. It's one of the big professorships in Oxford. So all of the statutory professors, you are contractually obliged to lecture for 36 hours a year. I'm just going to say that is every single year, just so you don't think I'm being lazy. We have Tolkien's original contract. He signed 126 hours a year. Somehow, he signed up for far more than he should have done, and he fulfilled it. And he fulfilled it in spades. There's no such thing as lazy Tolkien. He was doing his job, and in his spare time, actually I have no idea what he was doing, but I just... Let's look at the middle, because God knows I need another drink. To take a passage that, or a series of passages that Tolkien would have appreciated. Poetry. How poets spoke poems in Old English. And in fact, there are only 4 places in Beowulf where it talks about poets singing. And I'm producing my own new edition of Beowulf with a translation, which, as you know, is just exactly what the world needs. And this is where I would have shown you pictures of my children so you would go out and buy them. My children, I mean, because they're all... Obviously, the books will sell themselves. It's very notable, and I'm going to claim this is my aperçu, is that, funnily enough, there are only 4 places in Beowulf where we get descriptions of poets singing poetry, and after each of the examples of a poem, we get a monster. And it would never have occurred to me, except I was trying to write something for this. So here we go. And I'm going to give you the versions. Now, what I've tried to mark them up with is, this is why Beowulf is impossible to translate. Everything in purple is a poetic word. In other words, it's a word that doesn't occur in normal prose. It's just a poetic word. How do you do that? It's like the 18th century poets, writing to their beloved and saying, "Thou hast chingled the dingles from the very welkin." It's only going to work for a very limited audience of chingly-dingly welkin lovers. Everything in red is what is called a hapax legomena. This is a word that only occurs once in all Old English. Now, we used to think that if we had more Old English, all of these hapaxes would disappear. What we can now show, and again, things have moved on since Tolkien. I'm a very happy recipient of 2.5 million euros from the lovely European Research Commission, which obviously after Brexit became suddenly worth a lot more because the pound... So I'm mapping all of poetry that was composed within Anglo-Saxon England in Old English, in Latin, in Welsh, in Irish, in Norse, in whatever. We can demonstrate that their coinages is a thing. Hapaxes is a thing. How do you translate a word that doesn't occur anywhere else in the poetry? Alliterative effects, parallels and echo words. Anyway, I'm going to just skip through these. What I want you to notice is that they all echo each other, that the Beowulf poet ties in all of the previous experiments in how you translate, how you talk about poetry with all of the others. I'll just read them quickly before somebody collapses and dies. No, he's supposed to go. There was hairpun sway, swittle sang shoppers, Steris of the Cuda, from shaft fair and reckon. There was the harmony of the harp, the clear song of the poet. He spoke who could recount from the far back the beginnings of men. Just listen for the parallels. Huilum Kuningastein, Gumichil Pladen, Yidda Yamundi, so the El Faila, El Yesayana, Warn Yamunda, Word of the Fan, Sauda Yabundan, Sedge Eft Ongan, Sees Beowulf, Snitrin Styrian, and on Sped Rekkan, Spell Yarada, Wordum Rixlan. This is the passage that I chose for Tolkien's memorial in Pembroke, because I thought, and this is the bit in runes, a man full of fine words with a memory for stories who remembered all the many multitudes of ancient tales. I wish I could say I wrote that. Yeah. Thank you. I will. Yeah. Please don't call me Oscar. Leave my testicles alone. There was, and that's not a phrase I thought I would use at the Tolkien Society. There was sang and sway somewhere theatre for hit and so on. Hilweisen, Gorman would do yet that yid off reckon, on a hell gammon, Hrothgar a shop, over the made bencher, man and shoulder. Be finnes everum, that he's a fair be yat, hell at half day and a knafshil dinger in frays while a fail and shoulder. Okay. Listen to this. Sulich spell we're getting to. There was yed on Gleo, Gomala shielding, fair frigenda, fair and recta, Wheelum Hildedare, a herpan winna, Gorman, Woodu Greta, Wheelum yid arek, Soud and Sarlik, Wheedum Sulich spell, recta after richta. Rumhert Kuning, Wheelum eft ongan, Eldo Yabunden, Gomel good wea, Yodu Quidan, Hilda Strengo, Chreder in a whale, Donna he wintrum frode, Warden Yamunda. This is Beowulf. It's not just Beowulf. How many types of poetry are there in this last passage? This is an old man looking back. He recounted from far back. At times the battle-bold one touched the harp with pleasure, the entertainment would. At times he pursued a tale true and tragic. We're looking back. We're looking over there. We're looking then. That world is going to fail. It's going to fall. It's going to end. But we love it still. At times he recounted a wonderful tale. A tale of marvels, a tale of miracles, a tale of dragons, elves, dwarfs, a tale from somewhere else. At times, in turn, weighed down with age, the old war fighter began to sing sad songs to his youth. His powers in battle, his breast inside welled up, when wise in years he called many, many things to mind. It's freighted with regret, with the fact that, this is where we touch on Tolkien's war experience, some of the good guys never came back. Some of us never lived through this. I've given you on the last page, I'm happy to answer questions and I won't go through it. I think a beautiful passage which I'm really sorry never made it into Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics in the lecture as it was actually given. And I commend it to your attention. I'll skim through it. I mean, I think it's terrible. You know, I feel like I'm doing a German PowerPoint when I just read the screen. But my apologies to all the... Is there anyone I haven't offended? Beowulf is not a primitive poem. It's a late one, at the end of an epoch, using the materials then plentiful of a day already changing and passing, which is far now and forever vanished, swallowed in oblivion, and using them for a new purpose with a wider sweep of imagination, if with a less bitter and concentrated force of mood. Beowulf was already antiquarian in a good sense, and it now produces a singular effect. For it's now itself to us ancient, and yet its maker was telling of things already old and weighted with regret, and he expended his art in making keen that touch upon the heart which sorrows have that are both poignant and remote. So that if the funeral of Beowulf, all right, I'm stopping in a minute. So the funeral of Beowulf moved once like the echo of an ancient dirge, it is, all right, to us a memory brought over the hills, an echo of an echo. There is not much poetry in the world that has this effect. And here's the interesting bit. Though Beowulf may not be among the very greatest poems of our Western world and its tradition, Tolkien never thought Beowulf was better than the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, all of these other poems. He never thought his own contributions were better or different, but they were what they were within the confines. It has nonetheless its own individual character and peculiar solemnity, which no comparison can take away, its own ancient cadences of verse, its own thought. To recapture such echoes is the final fruit of scholarship in an old tongue, and it's the most important, the most honourable object, rather than the analysis of a historical document. Fruit that is good for all to eat if they may, but which can be gathered only in this way. For such reasons, ultimately, do we truly study Anglo-Saxon. At the end of his valedictory lecture in 1959, we have the 60th anniversary next year, he quoted a bit from The Wanderer. It's a bit that you'll all be familiar with because it's a bit that also appears in The Lord of the Rings. Huercom mago, huercom madam yifn, huercom simble satu, huer sinden tele dreamas. Eala becht buna, eala ben wea, eala therdnes thrum. Usio thrag je wat je nap under nick telm swa hail. Nowhere. Where is the steed? Where is the treasure giver? Where are the joys of the hall? Where are the settings of the feast? Where are the joys of the hall? Alas for the bright goblet. Alas for the burnished warrior, the burnied warrior. How that time has passed away, gone down deep under the shadows, as if it had never been. That's the timelessness, literally timelessness, of Tolkien. And I think that's what Tolkien owes to the first 3 lines of Beowulf. Thank you. Happy to answer questions if there are any. Apart from, what?
What is that the old soldiers do? They come back and they don't talk about it. And some of them, admittedly, never talk about it. And then later on, there's that, we were young, we were great, it was a bad time, but it wasn't the worst time because there was camaraderie and there was courage and there was, you can hear echoes of it in Beowulf, and you can hear echoes of it in Remember the First World War, even much more recent conflicts. If you were there, we don't need to describe it to each other because we know and only us can share it. But it's almost become a sweetness to a memory that was originally very, very bitter.
Yes, of course. Yeah. I think one of the most poignant things that we have a thing called, it's a misnomer, it's called Tolkien's Celtic Library. It's about 230 books. They're not all Celtic. They were in the English faculty in Oxford, they're now in the Western Library. But for example, his great friend, and this is one of the things that I'd be interested and I'm slightly worried about with regard to the film that's coming out. Geoffrey Bash Smith was one of his great friends. And a lot of the Welsh books, poetry, for example, are in this collection, and they're signed Geoffrey Bash Smith, and then Tolkien just adds willed to me, or by will, after the Battle of the Somme. Yeah. And that's it. And imagine that book, those poems, freighted with all of the kind of friendship and loss and camaraderie and all of that stuff. And I mean, Tolkien, if any of you know any multimillionaires, I think one of the tragedies at the moment, something that Tolkien would completely abhor that's going on at the moment, is we don't have enough money in Oxford for the Celtic chair. And this is one of the oldest Celtic chairs in the world. And Tolkien would be fighting to keep the Celtic chair going for that kind of a reason. And I'm, in my, pathetic way, trying to keep it going for that kind of a reason too. There's an interconnectedness. You can't separate Welsh from Geoffrey Bash Smith. You can't separate Celticness and that brilliant lecture, Lazy Tolkien. But hey, the few lectures that he gave were all fantastic, English and Welsh. That's a great lecture. I think we're in danger of losing that. But yes, no, there is a kind of reticence. But you pour it into other directions. So, Andy.
So that's interesting. So when Tolkien,
What do you mean? That's interesting? Nothing else was interesting?
no, it was all very
God,
interesting.
he's a tough crowd.
No, it was all interesting. Oh my God, you gave me lots of stuff. But when Tolkien wrote Narquelion in the earliest version of the Elvish language of Quenya in 1915,
Yeah.
was he following? Do you think he was following in that tradition of translating poems into other languages,
Yeah,
basically?
absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and that's what kind of spurred him on to do that, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also the kind of the nachlas, the kind of extra stuff that you get associated with all of those materials is, again, I mean, I feel like a sort of a dinosaur or a relic. I just happened to go through a similar experience where, there was this amazing book, this book called Ainger and Whittle, a Latin Gradus, where if you wanted to know the words for, grief, pain, sorrow, those are the only themes I can think of, but probably happiness was included. I just never got round to it. And it would give you 15 Latin words which would scan in different ways for these kinds of things. And a lot of what Tolkien is doing is thinking about synonyms in different forms, and partly what he's doing in terms of trying to create those languages, he's not going for the obvious. Right?
No.
He's going for what you might call the more poetic. I can't demonstrate that, I can't prove that, but that's why I keep you around.
Well, in the Quenya lexicon, he indicates poetic words.
Yeah,
definitely.
exactly.
Yeah. He's inventing poetic words, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But somebody has to,
Yeah.
and I haven't got the time. So. I was going to say I killed it.
I have two questions, one of which is completely... Is this working? Does it matter? Which is completely irrelevant to exactly what you've been talking about.
If I want to hear it, yeah.
And the other one, you can stop me, is shorter and is relevant. Now, the irrelevant one is this. Okay, everyone here has read the letters at some stage.
Oh.
And Tolkien is writing, I can't remember who he's writing to, and describing a discussion about the meaning of the name of Smaug.
Yeah.
I can't remember which verb it is. It's
Smilka.
whatever it is.
Yeah.
He says it, in a side sort of way, it describes something which is squeezed through a small hole.
Yeah.
I don't know what my mind is like, but that struck me that the dwarves or somebody was being very, very rude about Smaug. I mentioned this to a colleague of mine in academia in a completely different place, and he said, "Don't be stupid. Lewis and Tolkien were English gentlemen. They would never think such a thing, let alone say it."
I can refer you to any number of poems where they were far from being English gentlemen. And also, I mean, there's two things going on there. So there's smergan, which is the kind of, being smart, being clever. So being slick, How about that? Let's go with that. And then if you think about modern, I don't know why I did that. If you think about modern Icelandic, because you, so there's the word smjor, which is where we get modern English smear. And I mean, one of the great things, and Iceland is one of those places that Tolkien never went to, but should have gone to. And I think one of the few things where I can say that I have won over on Tolkien is I was a mountain guide for 9 years in Iceland every summer for 9 years. Wow. And in Iceland, they have a word smjor, means butter.
All sounds straight out of Red Dwarf.
It does, yeah. But when margarine came in, they called it smjörlíki. It's like butter. And then when beer came in, they had to invent a word for American beer without using anything to do with any bodily functions. And they come up with björlíki. It's like beer. But it's not really beer. You had a second question,
which is slightly more relevant. In the notes to Beowulf, the edition.
Which actually I didn't mention, but they are the best bits of that.
Yeah,
They're
absolutely.
fantastic.
The notes always are the best, and they certainly are here. He mentioned something which probably should have occurred to me decades ago, but never did. The word weird.
Yeah.
He just remarks it's a past participle.
Yeah.
Means happened.
Yeah.
That means that in Old English you can translate it as stuff happens.
Yeah.
Which is struck me as being a very Old English way of looking at it. Am I going right off the rails here, or do you think I would have thought like that?
No, because anything, I mean, that D ending, past participle, so it's a bit like the word hervod, which means head, but literally your hervod is the bit which is heaved, lifted above the rest of you, right? And so the word metod, which is the word that Tolkien talks about as being like weird, like fate and so on, it means the measured thing, the having been measured thing. So that in the poem, like the Wanderer, we talked about a little bit ago, in line 3 of the Wanderer you have the word metod, which is the kind of the most meanest, it's just fate. A bit further on, line 8, it's so sad, but I guess I'd get paid for this. So. Line 89, I'm so sorry, of the Wanderer, it talks about Shipend, which is the creator, which is one down from, it's not just fate, it's a person. And then line 115, fader. Fate becomes a creator, becomes daddy. And that's the whole message of the poem in those 3 words for God. So yeah, no, I mean, Tolkien wrote a lot about weird, and in fact a lot of it's not published, but it was, he's kind of wrestling with it all the time. But ultimately, that's right, it's impersonal.
Yeah. They did occasionally think of weird as being this kind of...
If you forgive me for pushing back against stuff happened, because again it's that whole,
That's a modern way of saying it, but
I know. I'm not really.
That does what it means. It's
I'm not cut out for Legally Blonde.
They did. They did think of the 3 as goddess sometimes in a poetic sort of way, but I just thought perhaps maybe when they were out there with their helmets on, clocking each other with their swords, they weren't thinking about poetic goddesses. They were thinking that stuff is happening.
Oh yeah. Oh no, I'm sure that's true. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for beautiful talk. Slightly feeding off the stuff happening, not happening, slightly feeding off Lynn's first question, with the Ubisund poems, which are quite ubiquitous from classical period to modern days, with this kind of distancing that you were talking about, do you think Tolkien might have seen it as a kind of excuse of the world that the poet, the writer speaks from? That it's not our fault that the world has gone to bits. It's just this impersonal progress of fate that we cannot be the great people of the past because they are in the past.
Yeah. I think yes. Well, the short answer is yes. Well, I mean, something I would love to know, and it's a very difficult thing to track down because we don't have. We have his library. We know what he read. We know what he could have read. We know. I mean, you can sort of imagine it, but part of this project that I'm working on is Alcuin. I don't know if you've heard of Alcuin. So, Alcuin, or as one of my Canadian students once memorably said, Al Cohen, is he Jewish? That's right. Yeah. The first Anglo-Saxon Jewish poet. But Alcuin, who died in 804, not a moment too soon, I'm not a big fan. But he was born in York and then ended up working for Charlemagne. But he writes very, very beautiful Ubisoft type poetry of exactly the type that seemed to me very much closely echoed. So I'll do this slowly Alcuin, poem 23. Nos misery, we wretches, quote fugitivum mundus amamus, tu fugisar nobis semper ubi queruens. We wretches, why do we love you, world, when you're always running away from us? You fail us. You run away from us. And all we can do is follow after. That's not ubi sunt, but that's much closer to the kind of sentiment of what Tolkien's talking about, which is not, it was all much better in the olden days. It was like, it's good to be alive.
And since we're on the subject of Alcuin, he also has Omer Keller,
Yeah.
which is this incredibly, for me, Tolkienian appreciation for the surrounding nature, the particulars of your everyday life. And he's describing his cell, and it's been argued that it's actually his cell in
Aachen.
York.
No, Aachen. Yeah.
Well, now it's been debated.
Yeah. No, they're wrong. It's Aachen.
Uh,
I refer you to my article of. Yeah.
My York supervisor would hardly
I know,
agree.
but Mary Garrison can be wrong too. Just to guess who your supervisor was. Yeah. It doesn't matter in a funny way. Bizarrely, I've just been doing all of Alcuin's poetry for this project. I think Alcuin's a far more important Anglo-Saxon poet than we give him credit for. It would have killed me to say that about 10 years ago, or even 10 minutes ago, to be fair. But I think this is the point. We need to think of Tolkien as being an Anglo-Saxonist who, because of his training, because of his background, because of his skills, linguistically and others, is actually operating at a much higher level than most Anglo-Saxonists operate on today, where Anglo-Saxon is taught as part of English. And he's thinking of it in a much broader sense. Bede, the man that my mother, and I always try and make her say this because it tickles me, but my mother always calls him the Admirable Bede, right? But at the beginning of Historia Ecclesiastica against Sanclorum, the ecclesiastical history of the English people, Book 1, Chapter 1, he says there are 5 languages in these islands, and we should never forget, this is not going to be a Brexit comment, we should never forget that there are 5 languages. And he talks about English, and he talks about, calls them the Scots, but he means the Irish. He calls them the British, but he means the Welsh. He calls them the Picts, and it's like, oh, we've got no idea. And then he says, and then Latin, and he does actually use the word, it's kind of, the one language to bind them all. And then at the very end, Book 5, the last chapter of Book 5, he revisits those 5 languages. And that's incredible. And I think Tolkien and his generation were very much plugged into the fact that we're not talking about a monolingual, monocultural society, but we're talking about a society which lived with lots of different languages. Substitute the Picts for the Vikings. And then, the events of the 14th of October, 1066, frankly, for me, it's still a little bit too soon. But I gather something horrible happened. And here we are. Hands up, who's asleep?
Will you do me a favour?
I do,
Read the first bit again, please.
which bit?
Just say the
Kitty McBride poem.
Oh, that. Oh, I thought you wanted a bit of Beowulf.
Oh yeah, that too.
anything. Just read it. Where can you buy a CD?
Tough room.
All right. Let's go with Alfred. Alfred is good. Alfred is good because we can then kill it with Alfred. So what did King Alfred say? Is that I really need a drink. No, that's it.
You burned the cake.
He did burn the cakes, but just before he failed to get through to the final of MasterChef, he said, here's a bit of Old English I think everybody can appreciate and understand. So, Ora I eldren, our elders, our ancestors, the thus stoa hielden, who held these places before, he loved on wisdom, they loved wisdom, and furthone he beyetan wellan, and through that they got wealth, but it means not just money, but wealth. And us left on, and left it to us. Hier mon me yet you see in here aswad, and we can still see their traces. Ac we him after na kunnen spirian, but we do not know how to follow after them. For then, we've lost the traces, we've lost the tracks. And for then, we haven't either forleten, either a wellan, either a wisdom. And because of that, we've lost the riches, and we've also lost the wisdom. Just saying everybody should learn Latin. No. But that's kind of element of we've lost something, but it's not just things were better in the old days. It was like the old days, the faraway days, the distant days, the places that are other from us. All of those lands that Tolkien recreated is something that we can genuinely, honestly aspire to. And it's not fooling ourselves. It's recreating something.
The strange thing is, as a non-linguist, there's something familiar in the words.
Yeah.
You know, I don't do languages, I don't do anything like that at all. But when you were speaking those lines, there was almost a familiarity there.
Yeah.
It
Like it
made
rings a
some
bell.
kind of sense.
It's your language.
Not mine,
it's-
love.
Yeah, but it's but it's all of our languages, you know, and it's not, you know. That's why we do this. Oh God, here we go.
Bearing on the point Lynn was just making, and you were making.
Can we
about
just
our
check when the
language-
bar is closing before? Yeah. Point of order. And when I order, get me 2 of these. Yeah.
The point you were making about language and how it's familiar because it's actually the ancestor of what we're saying now.
Yeah.
And also what you were saying earlier about the hapax and
Yeah.
the poetic words
Yeah.
that they're from poetic usage, they get thrown into the poems and stuff. And we don't know what these hapax are. They're really hard to translate because we haven't got that cultural background that they've got, where it's almost like it's a new coinage made by the scope as he's reciting and entertaining. But am I right in understanding that essentially, because of how those people lived in several languages, effectively, they could get straight away from the context what that meant, even if it was a completely new coinage?
Yes and no, because I mean, all good poetry should be interpreted, and all good poetry needs to be interpreted. And so, if you get a hapax, I'll give you one example, but I'll carry on. But Shadowganger, so I come of Moro under Mistleo them Grendel Gongan. So Grendel is coming out of the moors, and he's described as a Shadowganger. Shadowganger is really obviously shadow walker. And you've all have heard shadow walker, and Tolkien uses the word shadow walker. But it's a hapax. What does shadow walker mean? Does it mean somebody who walks in the shadows, who's a golem? Does it mean somebody who's a walking shadow? Or does it mean both? And actually, yeah. And so the whole point about hapaxes is they're supposed to trouble us. Manshada, in the same bit of Grendel, is another one. So Manshada means literally man destroyer. Is a man destroyer, Scather? Is a man destroyer somebody who destroys mankind, or is it somebody who's a destroyer who happens to be in the shape of a man? And then if you factor in the fact that in Old English, man, with a long A, written the same, means crime, is it a criminal destroyer, or is it a destroyer of crime? So is it? So you've got 4 possibilities.
And also is it...
And Grendel is all of them. And that's the genius of the Beowulf. The Beowulf part is unbelievably brilliant. And I say this as I'm a trained classicist. The first time I read Beowulf, I thought it was complete crap. And now I read it every year, and I teach it every year. You know, I was going to say like Tolkien. I'm not like Tolkien, but and every time there's something else.
So can we also perhaps say that the hapax is a kind of, you click a poetic imagination to understand?
Yeah, I think you need to be plugged in to know what's going on. I mean, you know, if I don't know if you read your copy of translation of Beowulf, you know, he goes off on a big number about Hrongrada. Is it whale riding? Is it the whale road? And it's like, dude, calm down, man. There's other stuff you might want to think about, you know. Yeah.
But isn't there also the Irminlauf idea too? You know, when he says Irminlauf's, what is it, Irminlauf's brother or something? You're supposed to know who Irminlauf was.
Yeah.
He just throws it out there like we're supposed to know who Irminlauf was. Yeah. We have no idea who Irminlauf was.
You know, I think Irminlauf means mighty remnant. So, you know, who's the big remnant guy? Okay. Oh, there was one at the back. And then...
Yes, you did mention some limericks earlier. I wonder if we could
I am not going to give you the limericks, although I have them on my machine. If I summarise one of the limericks, I think you'll see my point. And it took me a long time to find out what the originals of these limericks were, because they're so offensive they've been dropped. But one that I can share with due apologies is... And that's why we don't translate these. But if you can imagine turning that into Old English, right? And that's one of the cleaner ones. But I think, I mean, I'm not being funny, but I genuinely think this is what they were mostly doing in the pub of a Tuesday afternoon. But I can't demonstrate it, but we do have these. I prefer to think of, let's turn the opening lines of Paradise Lost into Old English. Because can you imagine what a mighty audience there is for in fact, if anybody out there is a publisher, and I could fund the Celtic Chair by simply publishing these things, I'd be more than delighted. Are we good? We good? Thank you so much.